So if you're going to deal with U.S. policy and regulation or want an update, you need to have folks on the front line. So a familiar face chairing the session is Mike Druckman from the esteemed law firm of Hogan Lovells, but also a dear friend and colleague, Janet Marchibroda, who leads the Alliance for Cell Therapy Now. Joanne Kurtzberg at Duke and I are honored to chair the advisory board for that organization. It is another organization that has engaged in important public policy initiatives, very much leaders on the regenerative medicine provisos in the 21st Century Cures Act, and also moving forward progressive policies and with the FDA ethically moving forward so that we can get these treatments sooner rather than later. Also, a good friend and colleague, Giacomo Lanzoni, who has worked with the Alliance for Cell Therapy Now from the Diabetes Research Institute. And we've heard from Giacomo before, whose scientific expertise has definitely aided and constructively what we are doing now, moving regulation forward. Mike, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Bernie, again. For those that weren't here this morning, I'm Mike Druckman. I'm a partner in the international law firm Hogan Lovells, and I co-chair our firm's Global Cell Tissue and Gene Therapy Working Group, which comprises over 150 lawyers around the globe in 5 continents, advising on a whole wide range of disciplines. We're going to each just introduce ourselves, and it's not really heavily moderated. We're each going to kind of share our thoughts and then welcome you all to ask some questions and prompt some discussion. So the first, my perspective is that we're really at an important inflection point in the development of regenerative medicines, particularly with FDA. And FDA faces a bit of a self-identity crisis and a sort of a, in its own understanding of what its role should be. As I mentioned this morning, there's FDA had viewed itself for years. I was in the Office of Chief Counsel of FDA, and it viewed itself as setting the gold standard around the globe that everyone would look to. But that model was based on, small molecule drugs, much easier to characterize than biologics, including regenerative medicines. And the patient populations typically were much larger, much easier to address in large trials that could produce the kind of data that would be much easier to interpret. FDA faces a turning point, and our industry, your industry, really is leading that charge, that pressure. There's been a recognition, even Peter Marks, who spoke earlier in the conference, who's the center director for the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, CBER. He has acknowledged publicly that the existing model, the drug model, does not really work well for cellular therapies or even gene therapies, and that it's going to be necessary to come up with some sort of interim pathway, some middle ground that will recognize some of the differences that these products pose. And Giacomo will talk about some of the needs for that. So they've already recognized that the existing model doesn't really work. And on top of that, they've are facing now a bunch of challenges from a bunch of different directions. On one hand, as we all know, we just went through this pandemic in which millions of people were administered vaccines that did not go through the full FDA approval licensure process, that rather they were issued on what's called an emergency use authorization, for which the standard is really a balancing standard against the crisis. And while there was a bunch of issues about reliability, FDA was, sort of took the view that it had to meet the emergency. But as a result, we have a lot of products that the American public is now very familiar with that did not go through the full process. Some of them now have. But for industry, it became clear that it's really, there's more flexibility and a need for flexibility more than actually has been traditionally the case for FDA. Another challenge that FDA faces is that in the tissue world, there's some litigation. Probably many of you have heard of the California Stem Cell Treatment Center case in California, where a district court judge issued an opinion that, if taken to its logical conclusion, could really undermine FDA's jurisdiction in certain very critical ways. It's on appeal. There are briefs that have been filed, but the outcome of that could really change the face, depending on where the Ninth Circuit comes out, could really change the face of how FDA operates. Now, likely they have strategies for dealing with even the worst kind of situation, but at least it poses a fundamental question about the role that FDA should be playing in ensuring the safety and effectiveness or not of these kinds of regenerative medicine and tissue products. And it's another factor that's causing self-examination and a need and a lot of scrutiny about what the role that the US FDA should be playing. The other factor that's coming in is that there's new legislation. Janet will talk about that, and new mechanisms that are hoped to play a role in making the approval process for these products faster, more efficient. There's a new creation of something called the platform designation, which has not actually been implemented. I actually just asked Dr. Marks the other day about it at this conference, and he sort of acknowledged it hasn't been put into play. They have a mechanism for at least discussing the issues, and it would recognize that it's important not to force companies to reprove over and over established principles that have already been tested and established to an extent that should be sufficient. So we have all these different pressures, and as we talked, as my colleague Brian Walsh mentioned earlier today, there have been situations where companies, and as Dr. Hare mentioned, and Kyle Citrullo, there are companies that feel they've got no choice but to go outside the United States. And many are asking the questions, is the United States a viable place at all to test these kinds of medicines? My own view is that we should continue to work on this. And collectively, we should try to use our voice, the mechanisms available for public input, for industry input, to try to help. I can tell you that the people I know at FDA are very sincere about trying to make changes that will be important. And so I do think there's opportunities for us to contribute and guide, but I do think it'll be important to help FDA try to meet this challenge and for them to implement the laws. Congress creates statutes, but it's very important how they are implemented. And it'd be very important for FDA to take advantage of that and to industry also to really understand. So with that, I'm going to turn the microphone to Janet and have her share some insights.
Thank you, Mike. It's really great to be back here at the World Stem Cell Summit and the Regenerative Medicine Essentials course. In person, post-COVID, isn't it great? It's been a while. I'm the president of the Alliance for Cell Therapy Now, as Bernie said, and our foundation. It's an amazing group of nationally recognized leaders, most in the academic and medical institutions across our country, including here at Wake Forest, who are working together to advance regenerative medicine and cell therapies. So really quickly, because I know we're short on time, I'm just going to pull from Mike's conversation about the landscape. Advocacy is really important. I would say that nothing big happens in our country when it comes to the development and manufacturing of these important therapies unless we have advocates calling for change. A lot of progress has been made at the FDA, due mostly by both user fee authorization guidance as well as legislative actions. Probably the biggest, and I think Mike referenced this, probably the biggest change was a while ago. It was 7 years ago. The 21st Century Cures Act, for the first time, put money into clinical trials funding, and we're going to talk about that in a second, as well as some changes in a regulatory framework and some other things along the way. Congress, in addition to FDA, Congress also authorizes and appropriates funds to other agencies that matter very much to us. So there's some work going on at HRSA that will have impact on our industry. But the big thing, and we don't have time in our 20 minutes today, is ARPA-H. And I'd encourage you to look at what's happening. It's funded. There's a lot of emphasis on our types of therapies there. So examples of how legislative change has made a difference. You've heard about real-world evidence, right? So different ways of evidence development for your therapies, those wouldn't happen unless we were pushing for that. And there was a lot of legislative language. Mark McClellan, who's now here in North Carolina at the Duke Institute, had a lot to do with it. It's a big thing also for Rob Califf, who's also from Duke, from this area. Things like accelerated approval means a great deal to us. The RMAT program, of course, which we know about. This is a big thing. If you look at Peter Marks and CBER's budget, he was not, and you think about the growth in the field, there wasn't enough funding in there for staff in order for him to meet the demand. And Congress helped solve that problem. And it's great to see the reorganization that's well underway. I think the closing date for the new lead was May 31st. So hopefully we'll see someone in there that will oversee much of the work around cell therapy. And I'm going to go fast. I do have to make a plug for my advisory board, who's amazing. We were proud to have we got language, significant language in the bill last year, the appropriations bill, and the last 4 years actually to support cell therapy. In the interest of time, one last note about the role of Congress, and maybe my friend Giacomo will reference this a little bit as well. While we've seen a lot of advancement at FDA, Congress did 7 years ago, it wasn't a big amount, but it was unprecedented. They said, federal agency, NIH, you should put $30 million into funding for clinical trials. Well, we count 7.4 million on the NIH website as of a couple of weeks ago. Still not there yet. 30 million isn't enough because if you look at the data, the vast majority of clinical trials are being conducted by folks like you, academic and medical institutions, small biotechs, and the funding's a big problem. And I think the advocacy is going to be really important, and if you're up for it, we're going to do a classroom session at 3:15 on 101 on advocacy, and we will focus on funding. But go to Giacomo.
Thank you, Jen. It's fantastic to be here with you and have a conversation on what the regulatory panorama is here in the United States. Well, I'm going to give you some real-world examples of what we have been facing in the interactions with the FDA. And real-world examples that are related to how there are gray zones in regulations that we need to address. And we basically need to inform the FDA of what we are thinking about and hopefully have them band certain interpretation they're making of how our cell product work. So I'll give you the example of the 361 products versus 351 products. 361, many of you know about this type of products. They are typically autologous, minimally manipulated, intended for maybe a localized effect. And then we have 351 products, cell-based therapies, for everything else. Now I'll give you the key point of difference between 361 and 351. The 361 product can be developed and marketed if successful at the single patient level. And this is a big deal. Of course, a 361 product is intended for a single patient, whereas a 351 product is what we heard from Mike, is more reminiscent of a drug. Imagine an allogeneic cell product intended for thousands or millions of recipients. Well, now think about something that lays in between. For example, a preparation of cells intended for autologous use that is not exactly minimally manipulated, where we take the cells and let's say we expand the cells for a short time or we boost certain functions that we care about. Well, this type of product would not fit in either the 361 or the 351 category, in our opinion. And I believe more conversation needs to happen with the FDA and other regulatory agencies towards a policy change. And I want to hear your comments from the audience if there's anyone that has been facing similar gray zone type of development. I see some of you that are smiling, and I see that some of you have been here before. And if not, there's another important topic that we need to further develop as a field, and I believe is that of outcomes. We need to show that the cell therapies we're developing are really effective. And of course, in the setting of a clinical trial, a randomized double-blind controlled trial, it's easy, but it's not so easy if we're developing a platform type of manufacturing, or cells that have a lot of variability from subject to subject, imagine in the autologous setting. So it's important that we as a field develop ways to track those outcomes and maintain a conversation with the FDA, with the payers, with the health insurance, and so on, to demonstrate that we are really bringing a positive effect in patients. So I just want to hear your comments on that.
Can I, the outcomes database, so it's in legislation. We were behind it probably 4 years ago, and it directed the development of an outcomes database. So the federal agencies moved forward. It started at HRSA, but the problem was it only collected data on grantees. And so, Giacomo, I couldn't agree with you more about the need for us together, and this is a collective activity, for us to be able to be more transparent at outcomes. I think one of our biggest challenges is perhaps skepticism about efficacy for some of these therapies. And I think, going down the one-by-one road, yes, we need as many peer-reviewed, large-scale, I'm looking at Josh, large-scale, randomized controlled clinical trials as possible. But the problem is, the money, exactly. Small biotechs, academic and research institutions don't have the funds to get there. So we've got a big problem ahead of us, and advocacy is going to play a key role.
But we could leverage something like the ARPA-H opportunities right now. They're looking for platforms, yes, platform technologies, but something like a platform for outcome and analysis of the outcomes would actually be a big deal.
I want to make a couple comments about the 361 versus the 351 divide. So as Giacomo correctly said, there's a category of minimally manipulated products intended for what's called homologous use, which means the same function in the recipient as in the donor. It doesn't necessarily have to be autologous, but it can't be have systemic effect or be dependent on the metabolic activity of live cells. So it was intended to be somewhat of a narrow category that would not require evidence of efficacy. And so FDA created this category by regulation, and it sort of got out of control for a number of years. They've been trying to bring it back under control. They issued a guidance and have announced that they're going to take enforcement actions. It's been very slow. But the bottom line is that there's definitely still an important role for that. But it has to be recognized that there's not really mechanisms for those products to get any kind of efficacy data. And maybe there's a role for real world evidence. And Jen, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the feasibility of leveraging the products that have been on the market, some for over a decade. But I think that there's recognition, there has to be some sort of middle road where it shouldn't be that you're either not, there's no pre-approval at all, or you have to go through the very expensive, long, usually three phases of clinical trials in the hundreds of millions of dollars to establish efficacy to the standard that FDA requires for drugs. So, Janet, do you want to say a word on that?
Yeah, I think, I would say 7 years ago, no way. Something between 351 and 361, but I see a little bit of an opening here. And I don't know what the pathway is, whether it's, does it require legislation? Maybe not. And it's just in sort of the exceptions, and it could be performed by rulemaking. But I think there's a real opportunity here.
Let's pause and see if there's any audience questions. So we've got 5 minutes, so let's take some questions for the audience.
We could.
I can bring you the mic.
Does he? He's got a mic, Giacomo.
Oh.
This works.
Thank you. Hey. A couple of quick things. First thing, Mike, just some clarification on something you said earlier about the FDA and efficacy. It was my understanding that the FDA don't have any oversight when it comes to efficacy other than that pertains to the risk-benefit ratio. Is that, am I wrong there? That
Are you talking about 361 petitions?
Look, any oversight, the FDA's oversight on efficacy of product development, it's all about safety of communicable diseases and patient safety rather than efficacy. Am I wrong there?
Well, for drug products, which includes biologics, which would include cellular products that don't meet this 361 category, efficacy very much is. There's a statutory provision, it's kind of a long history. The Public Health Service Act is technically what governs biological products, which most of these would fall into that category. And so the standard is safety, purity, and potency that has to be established in order for FDA to issue an approval called a license for these biologics. But
potency is different than efficacy.
But potency, FDA interprets potency to include efficacy. So not only do you have to have potency assays to show the specific ability to achieve a particular result by in vitro testing, but there's also, FDA is interpreted as requiring regular efficacy trials to show clinical outcomes.
Okay.
For those.
And alignment between the potency observation and the observation in patients.
Yes.
Right. I know there are other questions. I just want a couple of quick comments.
Yeah.
The first is that Peter does talk regularly about this middle pathway that they're trying to propose, but it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. But Tony mentioned the other day that it can take 18 years to get to preclinical, another 7 years. Most people don't have that time to wait. So there absolutely has to be other pathways. And one of the issues with the gray area is that the FDA misclassifies a lot of these tissues. For example, umbilical cord, so Wharton's jelly is classified as a 351 because it's not, they don't consider it homologous use because they consider it a conduit. Wharton's jelly is not a conduit, it is a padding. It is a padding that has hyaluronic acid, et cetera, et cetera. So if it was classified correctly, same thing with adipose, the FDA considers it padding when it's actually a biologically active tissue. So we've got to get the definitions correct so that we can, thank you.
Thank you.
I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to make it very quick. Only comment I have is when they say that collagenase treatment changes the metabolic state, they don't define it. So do they mean that it's going to change maybe the surface markers, or is it going to change the transcriptomic profile of these cells? So since there is no definition provided, at least based on what I know, that makes it all the more difficult for clinicians to actually define what the standards are.
So are you talking about trying to set the dividing line between what could qualify as a 361 product without FDA approval or just generally? Generally.
For example, 361 would be collagenase treatment without collagenase treatment. So with collagenase treatment based on all the clinicians, it doesn't actually change the metabolic status. It's just going to loosen up the cells so that they're available for centrifugation. But the FDA claims that it does. So that's the
So in the end, FDA has a lot of discretion to make decisions about how it interprets its own regulation. And as I was mentioning, one of the factors that would disqualify a product is if it it depends on the metabolic activity of live cells or has systemic effect. But FDA, there's a lot of discretion in how they've applied that. And, and to Ian's point too, its own interpretation of things like whether amniotic fluid could qualify for the exception. In that case, they've stated it pretty clearly, but they've not been challenged. I mean, to my knowledge, there has not yet been litigation or other formal challenges in many of these cases. And so, what did you say? No, there are regulatory challenges possible also, most of which do involve internal FDA, something called formal dispute resolution, where if at one level there's a decision that you don't agree with, you can challenge it. The decision maker is the next higher person, and it keeps going up the level to, say, Peter Marks or ultimately the commissioner, but it's still FDA making the decision. What is a check on that is that ultimately when there's a final decision, that could be challenged in court. And they're very conscious about the fact that the record that they set on appeals like that would be reviewed in court and be subject to a court challenge. So even though those factors don't necessarily lead you to a totally independent view, it does have some leverage. There are other mechanisms too, happy to talk about it, advisory committees. I don't know if anyone else wants to weigh in. All right, I think we're out of time.
Yes.
But we really appreciate your engagement. Thank you for coming. And feel free to approach us after and continue the conversation.
A round of applause for this wonderful panel.